which is why sometimes the reason that I wanted to do this masterclass is because me, myself, and maybe you too, have experienced the following. We have moments when we just feel really, really good in life, when everything just seems to work for us, as in how we are doing physically, how we're doing mentally, and how we're doing emotionally. And then there's also moments when none of that is actually working. And the thing is, we tend to have this feeling that it's all kind of just going up and down. It's like a wave, right? And we just think that that's just how life is. And we don't know really what we're doing right when things are going right. And we don't really know then how to maintain it as well. And so as I myself went through my Ayurvedic training and got to experience physically myself as well, the things practically, I should say, then I also came to understand what I do wrong and what I do right. And I really wanted to share that. I wanted to share that because it's also something that I will then make into an actual course, okay, an online course, just like I already have an online course, which is more linked to the yogic perspective, linked to the Western psychology on self-image. Now, this Ayurvedic perspective linked to the Western perspective will also then be a course on how to learn how to read your own signals and therefore create a routine for yourself in that sense. All right. So what I want to do today is, before I even go into explaining what Ayurveda is, I want to explain why we are in the situation that we are today. Okay. I want to begin with describing the imbalance that we are on a general level today. Because in order to understand in what way this can actually be important for you, it needs to be personal, okay? And so by making it personal, you will integrate the information as well more easily, and then also be inclined to actually use the information that I'm giving you today in a different way, okay? And that is one of the most important things with Ayurveda, is the fact of implementing the concepts into your life. If you're not implementing them, you will actually not really notice any difference in anything. And it is just like yoga, actually. There's so many people that you have probably said it yourself at some point in life, that you think to yourself, I should be doing yoga, but you're not. And maybe even saying, I should be doing yoga, but I'm just not flexible. Well, as you all know, in order to actually become flexible, you need to do the yogic practice in order to get the flexibility into your joints. And so when it comes to Ayurveda, a lot of people have maybe ideas about Ayurveda, and they might even know that they should or should not eat root vegetables, for instance, or maybe they shouldn't have ice cream after dinner. That's actually the case for everyone. But they don't really know much more, and they're not really implementing it. And so therefore, they don't actually feel the transformation that it brings. And then it doesn't actually serve us at all. Okay, so this is why I really want to start with this perspective. In order to then use this, I will also give you tools to begin to read your own personal signals and your own personal constitution, and that will help you to detect early stages of imbalance that we actually all have on a regular basis, daily, more or less, and also offer just a few pointers that can be easily implemented in your daily routines in order to begin to find a more regular response of your nervous system, really. Okay, so let's see where we're at. Okay. We are very used to quite a few things in everyday life. And it's things like headaches, things like just feeling tired, feeling a bit dull, getting a cold, getting some fever, or even just being wind up and having difficulties to relax down. So what do we do with these things on a general daily, every day? Well, with headaches, it's very common. We just take, a pill. And with being tired and dull, what we tend to do is we reach for caffeine or even some kind of processed sugar to get a bit of a sugar kick and high. With a fever, obviously, it's very common. We will take an anti-inflammatory pill. And when we find it hard to relax, what do we do? Well, a glass of wine in the evening is very common to just wind down after a long day at work, right? And if you will, none of this is bad per se, okay? It's not bad, but what we're doing, and this is just what we do all the time, is that we're looking at a symptom of something and we're not looking for the cause of it, okay? And this is the reason that these symptoms keeps coming back. So some of you who might feel tired and quite heavy and dull in their head, for instance, regularly, and then just do what they usually do with the coffee, for instance, or some sugar, then they will just notice that this is how they are on a everyday basis. So it will become their routine to have a cup of coffee. And it's the same thing with the winding down. It will become so normal for us, and it's so socially acceptable as well, to go for a glass of something with alcohol in it after work, in order to wind down. And so we keep having actually symptoms in life that reoccur. And so we keep treating them with the same thing, and that means that nothing is actually healing anything. And as long as we keep on focusing on the symptom, what happens is that we even aggravate the state of imbalance in the body. Okay, for instance, headaches, which is very common and even very often seen as nothing really, even if you would ask a physician. Headaches are very often linked to two things: dehydration and lack of rest. Okay, feeling tired in itself seems like just a normal state for a lot of people. And we don't realize that feeling tired, or the dehydration that can be the headache, is actually symptoms of something. Just like with your physical body, when you have pains, for instance, in your joints, or you have acid lactic after heavily exercising, for instance, you know, this is more easy to read when it comes to the physical body, that this is a symptom of something. So we're a little bit more inclined, because it blocks us in our daily activities, to rest when we experience these things. The dullness, for instance, or when it happens with the head, the pain, the things that we can just take a painkiller for, it's just so easy to keep on going by taking some kind of pill or something that will help us to just continue with our day. And so the difficulty here is that we've come so far from understanding that this is not normal, that we try to function anyway. We try to compensate. Our natural state, perfect natural state, is a state of ease. And so actually, as soon as you don't feel at ease, you have already stepped out of balance. And one of the first things that I would like to just give to you today as an exercise to just do for 1 week from now on is to note to yourself whenever you feel at ease, when just everything feels at ease. And then also when you're not feeling at ease. And that means physically, it means mentally, and it means emotionally. And just note to yourself, ideally you would have your little notebook with you, but note for yourself what is happening in that moment. What is going on around me, the external environment? What time of the day are we as well? And then also, what is going on inside of me? What am I feeling right now? Am I feeling cold? Am I feeling warm? Am I feeling heavy? These kind of things. What are the types of thoughts that are coming up as well? What are the emotions? And so just to begin to actually get to know yourself by reading the signals of feeling perfectly at ease and not at ease. And even more so, noticing how often you actually don't feel at ease. So it feels like, for most of us, that in life, a big part of our day is about feeling ease, trying to reach for that ease, or try to find some kind of balance as well. We usually call that. We love using that word, don't we? Balance. And so balance in our relationships with other people, balance in eating the right things as to what our cravings might be, balance in having a healthy lifestyle and use those choices, as opposed to maybe feeling in a more recreation and lazy and just laying around, for instance, not being so physical, but also balance in the physical. So having a body that you want looks good and feels good, and just find a balance in, am I overdoing it, maybe even in my physical activities? And then, of course, the balance in just work and play in itself. Am I focusing only on work all the time, or on the contrary, am I pushing that part of myself away and try to just enjoy myself instead? And most of us try to reach for this balance. So we're struggling daily. It's like 90% of our activity is to try to find some kind of balance in this, because we feel as if we're constantly going in between the two. And we don't even know how to control when we're feeling good, to stay and to maintain that feeling good. And this is where I want to be a little bit of the psychologist that I am, because the essence of this striving, what it usually actually comes down to, is that we have a very distorted idea of what we need to be. Okay? We are striving for this because we want to be perfect. We want to be perfect because we need to work everything around us in perfection. So what we tend to do is that we activate ourselves in the morning with some kind of caffeine, and then we need to loosen up and be social with other people in the evening, for instance, using alcohol. And we need to work very hard to become beautiful and to be successful, and everything just needs to work perfectly, okay? And what's lying really, what's behind all of this need of perfection that we think that we're seeking by adding on things or doing things, is of course the very simple fact that we want to belong to other people. Okay, so what does this mean, wanting to belong to other people? Well, we want to be accepted by others. So this means in our relationships with loved ones, with professional relationships, colleagues, bosses, etc., our friends, and all of this is to ensure survival. Okay. So we need to, of course, give ourselves a break in the sense that all this trying so hard to strive for perfection, to have this balance with everything, is really linked to an urgent drive inside of us to belong. To belong means to survive, okay? And what we've misunderstood, and what I'm going to say now, you're going to agree with me, but really, just sit with those words for a moment, because what we've misunderstood in all of this is that there was never a need to change anything, because we were actually perfect when we came into life. We came into life just like anything else in nature around us, complete, perfect. So if you would look at a beautiful flower in your garden, a beautiful rose, its petals, everything is so perfectly done that you would imagine even that there's some kind of intelligence behind it that made it just that perfect. Okay? And it's so perfect from the grain until it's become a full flower, and it opens its petals to receive the sunlight, and then at nighttime it will close up as well because the sun goes away. Look at any of the animals. They're just living in their perfect being of what that kind of animal is doing. A bee is not trying to be a cat, if you see what I mean. It just is, in its perfection, and its obvious perfection, that being just the way it was from birth and until death is all that it needs to be. If we would, for instance, have a look in countries where the winter season is that cold that the soil freezes and might even snow, many animals will hibernate, right? And so it's in their natural balance that when the cold begins to come, they will go under earth, they will go into their nests, and they will sleep over winter. And it doesn't happen for them, the idea of, oh, maybe I should go out even though I'm hibernating and be active right now, because maybe that will make me more agreeable. Maybe that will make me more lovable. No, they just go with their flow. And so they're in a perfect, actually, harmony with themselves and with the rest of nature from day one of their life. And so what's the secret to that? Of course, it is that it is their true nature. And actually, that is the whole goal of Ayurvedic medicine. So Ayurveda in itself means science of life. Okay? And the goal of Ayurveda is not as much to cure a disease like any kind of medicine would do. It does. But the goal is actually instead to find again and stay with your natural constitution. And you see, by learning to stay with your natural constitution, you will actually look and feel perfect, just as perfect as the rose in your garden, just as perfect as the bee doing its thing. Okay? Your physical body and your mental body and your emotional body will therefore stay in its natural essence and be optimal that way. And when that's optimal, your spirit will shine through. And this is actually, if you will, from the Ayurvedic perspective, what enlightenment would be in that case. Okay? Now, we have come very far from this ourselves, which means that in our constant striving for finding this balance in life, we reach for what other people do and try to adapt what they do in order to feel more balanced. Now, this is what social media is really good at, right? Because we look at other people and they look so perfect, and so we try to do what they do. And very often it might work or it might not work. And the reason that it doesn't work is because actually each and one of us are completely unique in our constitution. So we try advices from other people, and if it doesn't work, we don't understand why it doesn't work. And especially if we look at what healthy means, we can see over time since, well, let's say since people really started to take a real interest in health and hygiene, I would say, we see how the trends have changed as well. They change because there's truth in each and one of them in a certain way, but because we realize that it also has negative impacts, we then adapt each and one of these trends and then come with new ideas, and then science evolves. But one that has always been saying the same thing, and that actually apparently supposedly is the oldest system of health, is actually Ayurveda. And I would even say that some of these health trends that we see today, more specifically, are working for some people, but they're actually detrimental for quite a lot of us. And there's a big part of the population today that swears by some of these health trends that aren't working for them. And that includes, for instance, the whole all eating salads, only raw food diet, or the intermittent fasting, for instance. The over exercising every day of the week, and also the different kind of extreme breathwork exercises that have become very popular, or the routines with the hot and the cold and the sauna and the ice bath and all of that. Once again, a little bit like taking the pills that I was mentioning earlier on. It's not necessarily anything that's bad per se, but what it is that it might not work for everyone. And one of the reasons that it can be really detrimental for a lot of people is that many of the people who do not need these kind of diets or practices, they tend towards them. And I will explain why in just a second, okay? So they will tend towards one type of new trend because it feels very familiar to them. It feels like something that they should be doing. And actually, it will aggravate their system. And the reason for this is what we have inside of us already will be the tendency that we will go towards. We see this in habit formation in our life that can also be called addiction. What feels easy, we will go for, okay? But that means as well that what feels unfamiliar for us, and this is when we try, for instance, to change a habit, we will not go towards because it will feel strange, it will feel difficult, and we will not feel like we know ourselves in this. And so then we will tend for what we recognize ourselves in, and we will go away from what is the opposite of ourselves. And so without straight away going into the Ayurvedic explanation of this, what this means is that if I'm a person who has a lot of fire inside of me, I will have a tendency to reach for practices and food and things to do that contains a lot of that fire element that will increase actually the fire inside of me. Okay? I will tend for that. I will be drawn to that because I will go for what I am. However, maybe what I need instead is to tend for water, let's say, something cooling down. But that will feel unfamiliar for me, so I will not have the tendency to go towards it if I'm not aware that this is what I need. So I hope that this makes sense to you. In a certain way, it is actually what the Buddha preached when he was talking about finding the middle way. So if I can start to learn more about what my tendencies are, who I am, if you will, then I will notice early on that I will tend towards things that might even aggravate who I am, and I can stop myself and then try to balance that out instead. In this sense as well, the Ayurvedic science and the yogic philosophy work very well together. They actually developed simultaneously, so we call them sister science, in India thousands of years ago. We talk about 5,000 years usually. That's not the subject of today. In what way can we see that Ayurveda and yoga work very well together? Well, this is exactly what I mentioned about what's familiar and what's not familiar and our tendencies. You see, yoga is a beautiful tool. It's a beautiful philosophy that brings spirit and spirituality into our daily lives. Yoga has a physical side to it that we all love today, which is almost what most people only know about yoga today, right? But what it does as well is that yoga is medicine, and taking the right way, it will heal us. Taking the wrong way, it can kill us. So knowing what we know about the tendencies and going towards what's familiar for us, naturally, there are a lot of people who will be very drawn to a type of yoga that will bring the same kind of qualities that they already have inside of them. And that can be detrimental for them. So for instance, going back to the example of the person who has a lot of fire inside of them, there can be a tendency to reach for the yogic practices that enhances this fire, and maybe even doing it at a time of the day where it's already hot, because then they enjoy feeling this transformational sensation of the sweating and the heat inside of them. However, with the understanding of the Ayurvedic principles, they can then understand that what they need as someone very fiery is to bring a more cooling way of being into their yogic practice, and also doing their yogic practice at a different time of the day. And I mentioned already that Ayurveda is supposedly the oldest system of healing science in the world, and that in itself is obviously something important to take under consideration, because it's been lasting then for a very long time. But one more thing is even more unique about the Ayurvedic teachings, and that is that Ayurveda considers the mind and the body and spirit at the same time. It takes the three subtle, the subtlest characteristics at the same time as the physical into consideration in as they explain how we function and what we need to do. And this pardon me, brings as well in the aspect of practical tools, so we can deal with imbalances on a more subtle level with more physical practices that will bring the subtle entities more into balance and which will make it easier. So this is why it's such a practical tool as well to have. We come back to this idea of a constitution again. Okay, so in Ayurveda, we consider the human being as part of everything else around us. Okay, and we have the macro, if you will, which is then the world around us, and then the micro, which is inside of us. And the balance that we're striving for is to stay with our constitution from birth, even when the external, the macro, changes and influences us. And this means that if we can find a way to control what's going on inside of us, when the things that happen outside of us changes, because that we cannot control, this is how we find well-being. This is how we find balance. This is the key. So for instance, once again, taking the person with the fire inside, if you have a tendency to lean then, of course, towards fire, you might have a tendency to be active in the middle of the day when the sun is at the highest, which is when the fire element is then also the dominant one. But if you can then have this understanding about yourself, you can balance that out by leaning towards cooling down in the middle of the day instead, or being more active when, for instance, water is more dominant in the atmosphere. And that way, by understanding your constitution, your original constitution, you can help yourself to balance out. So this means that the Ayurvedic teaching can really enhance your own life experience, because by learning to read your constitution and to apply that for balance, you can create depth in the moment. You can create awareness in the moment. You can create connection with the present moment. And you can create, ultimately, union with the present moment. Physically, we are then becoming lighter. We become more clear in the body, in the mind. And that is how, once again, spirit shines through. The same way that the rose is perfect in harmony and clear in its all aspects, and spirit shines through it. So the more we strive for our own natural, original being, the easier it becomes to actually just be in the present moment, and with nature and with people. What it means is, if physically I can reduce the toxins, then I can be at ease in this moment, and I don't need to run away from the present moment. In my mind, if I can reduce the toxins on the more mental aspects, then I can also be more clear, and I have no need to run away from the present moment. And of course, on the more emotional level as well, I will not be inclined to carry toxins that would look like worrying or planning ahead. I would be able to just be present in the moment, and therefore I can meet the external signals that I cannot control with resilience. So, by being in my natural constitution of balance, I become resilient. That means I can adapt into anything. And more than adapting, I thrive in the moment. So this is how we are born. Okay? We are born to thrive. This is not just some motivational speech that I'm coming with, because just like the flower, the plant, from the seed, it is also already born to thrive, basically in full potential. We are born in full potential. Okay? There's no human or plant or animal that come into this world without full potential, just half potential. So the whole goal is to guard, to maintain this potential, this full potential of us as we continue in life. Okay? And this is why Ayurveda is preventative more than anything. And as I said, it cures as well, but that is not the point. Okay? The Western modern science and medical science is a curative one. And not to cast any shadow on that, because we have basically become more or less immortal thanks to modern science. But the side of preventative science is not really a part of what the pharmaceutical companies basically are bringing to us today. One of the ways to just show how easily we have moved away from just what is our natural balance is the technology that advances in itself. And the first thing to look at there is electricity, for instance. So before we had electricity, it was just quite obvious that there was no other choice for us than to be active when there was a possibility to be active, because the sun was up and it was light. And then when there was no more light, well, there was nothing else that we could do than to sleep, basically. All right. And so we would do the things that you do when the sun is up, that are active, which means that we would be physically active in all sense of the word, and we will interact and we would eat. And then, of course, when the sun was gone, we couldn't do that anymore. So we would do the opposite of that. We would sleep. And if you would look at most of the difficulties that has developed into illness today, or just imbalance in itself, it is very much linked to these three things: activity, food, and sleep. Okay? And so we got out of balance already with the fact that all of a sudden we could do things when it wasn't naturally meant to be. And so the symptoms of imbalance begin to show, like I was mentioning as I started, with the tiredness or dehydration and these kind of things. And what we then do, of course, because we don't realize that this is just a signal to us, we try to compensate just so that we can keep functioning. And so what happens is that we exhaust all the resources and we get just completely depleted. And we've all experienced moments when we feel depleted. And when whatever we try, nothing is really working. And so usually what this shows up in is that either we get all dried out, okay, and we're creating nervous imbalances inside us. And we weaken our nervous system, of course, but also our immune system by doing so. And finally, we develop severe illnesses. Or we get all fired up instead. We're creating inflammation in the body. We create ulcers. And ultimately, we begin to develop severe illnesses there as well. Or we can also accumulate and we become stagnant. We develop depression, obesity, and finally start to develop severe illnesses there as well. Okay, so this is a little bit our tendencies today due to the fact that we've come away from just our very natural, our full potential that existed at birth. So now that I've spoken about that for 45 minutes almost, no, half an hour because we started late, I want to talk to you about what Ayurveda then actually is. Okay, so Ayurveda takes us as human beings into a holistic perspective. We are not different to the rest of the universe, if you will. At large, we're part of it. And because we have developed our prefrontal cortex with our consciousness, we have this idea from we are not. And it's as simple as everything of matter and spirit. Matter out of 5 elements. From more dense light, we have earth, water, fire, air, and space itself. Okay? And so everything around us that we can see, of course, and what we can't see as well, the more subtle, are all built up by these 5 elements. And so in Ayurveda, we then take this into the biological form. So these elements, when they come together in biological forms, in Ayurveda, we talk about energies. And so they come together in 3 different energies, or, and the word that I will use from now on will be this, doshas. Okay, these energies that are the 3 energies that we reduce, let's say, the 5 elements into in their biological form are called doshas. Okay, the 3 doshas I will explain now, and this is what you really want to take away kind of from today. So the 3 doshas from the first one to the last one are vata. So vata is the dosha, the energy which is the lightest, and it is actually the combination of air contained in ether or space. Okay, just a really small thing in case the idea of space or ether doesn't speak to you. So basically, space is what contains everything else. If you ever have heard a little bit about quantum physics, you might have heard about the subatomical level or not. Basically, what it means is that when we go really low into smaller than atoms, we notice that there's no such thing as solids, okay? So all the atoms are actually being held together, and what's holding them together is space. So we are actually 90-something% of space, okay? Just to make that one clear. So that is the vata dosha. The second dosha is called pitta, and pitta is fire contained in water. And the third dosha is called kapha, and kapha is the heaviest one, and that is earth contained in water as well. So this means that everything around us, and now I'm not just talking about what you see as in nature and animals and people, but also the air, the climate, is all made up of these 3 doshas. So how can I make this more clear to you? Well, if you would look at plants, we can see that there are leaves that are the typical leaves that we would find in one part of the world, maybe for a typical type of tree. Small, thin, quite fragile, that break easily, and usually quite long, for instance, or very small, on the contrary, very thin. That's one type of leaf. And we can see that this type of leaf is actually made up with the dominance of the air dosha. Okay, so we can see that it's quite light, which is obviously what air is, of course. And so these leaves, we find them as well in a part of the world where the climate is usually quite light, like air. But we have as well other types of leaves that are thick and heavy and full of water, and they're difficult to break even. And these kind of leaves we will usually not find in that same part of the world, but we would maybe find them more in a part of the world like a rainforest, in the deep, dark rainforest, where it's really moist, for instance. And then in deep part of the rainforest, it's not too hot even either, so it's quite damp and slow and cold, okay? So what I'm trying to explain by taking these 2 examples is that in an environment where one of these doshas is dominant, you will also notice the tendencies in the different plants that live there to have the same kind of dosha in dominance. So the characteristics of each and one of these doshas is then that the vata dosha, which is then once again air contained in space is all the qualities of air in itself. So it's light and it's dry and it's movement in itself, because wind obviously always move. That's what air is, right? And Pitta, which is then fire contained in water, is still quite light due to the fire actually element, but it's obviously hot most of all because of fire. And due to the water, it also brings a certain stickiness into it. So it's a little bit heavier and it's sticky. Okay, so this is why we also call this the middle one. It's the one in the middle between the two. And then the third one, which is Kapha, that I mentioned already, has earth and water, is the heaviest one. So the Vata and the Kapha are the opposite ones, let's say. Kapha then has the quality of heaviness and of dampness, of wetness, and cold and slow, therefore, as well. Okay, so I mentioned that Vata, which is very light, has movement as its activity, let's say. And in that case, we would say that Pitta, being the fire, well, it's action, right? Or even more so, it is transformation. And then Kapha, in that case, is the opposite somehow to both of them. And so Kapha is accumulation instead. It's stagnation. And we will find these three doshas represented in everything around us, but also in air. So this means in the climate, in the parts of the world, because of course, in different parts of the world, different elements are more dominant than others. So, for instance, all the countries around the equator have a lot of heat, which means that the Pitta is higher in general all around the year in these countries. The further we get from the equator, so the closer we get to the poles, we will find more representation of Kapha because of the cold. But depending on the time of the year, so the seasons, it will be more windy or less windy, it will be colder or warmer, and it will be drier or wetter as well. So, for instance, in order to make this more clear for you, if we would then take it from the plants and into the animals, for instance, a typical representation of the Vata dosha for animals would be, of course, the ones that lives in the air, a small bird. So a bird is quite light and quite dry and always moving, and also very creative, which is a more mental side of what Vata can bring out. And if we would look at the Pitta dosha, what we have there instead is, for instance, an animal that lives close to the equator. So let's say the felines, like the lions and the tigers. What do we have with them? They have a lot of fire inside of them. And because of the stickiness, they're quite smooth and they're very strong. But they're not at all as fast as the little bird. So they're more on the action in itself. So, for instance, we can see how a lion hunts, right? It stays still for a long time and it's very focused on its prey, and then it takes action. Typical Pitta characteristics. And then when it comes to the Kapha, we will, for instance, have a look at a tortoise, for instance, typically living as well in the water, right? Or even an elephant as well, where we have much more of this heaviness and the slow. But also, those are the animals, for instance, that lives the longest, right, as well. So there's something in it that is really essential for well-being. So here we have the three doshas, and how do we apply that to ourselves? Okay, so really, like in modern science, where we talk about DNA, our constitution, our natural constitution, in Ayurvedic perspective, functions the same way. So basically, we have a look at our parents, mother and father, what their constitution is, definitely will be a combination of that in us as well. But even if we would, for instance, look into from the psychological perspective, as a psychologist, for instance, I will have a look into the mental characteristics of a person linked to their, we would call this socio-economical environment or context of a person. And this is also the case in Ayurveda, because depending on where you are born in the world, your constitution will also be influenced by this. Okay? And actually, your constitution, just like the seed of the flower, is already made perfect and decided at conception. Okay? So depending on, actually, and I'm not going to go more into detail about that because we can do that at another point, but actually depending on when you were conceived in the year and where in the world, and the state of your parents as well, with their constitution, will have an influence on what your constitution will be. Now, every one of us, of course, have all three of the doshas inside of us, but there will be a difference. There will be like a ratio between the three that will be completely unique to each and one of us. Okay? Now, one of the biggest issues with people who want to balance themselves out, knowing just a little bit about the Ayurveda principles, is that they have a tendency to think that they need to level the doshas out inside of them. No. And this is where usually we go wrong. You do not want to, let's say, if you have a dominance of the kapha, you don't want to balance your kapha and your pitta out. It's not that you want to make your vata stronger, for instance, or bigger. That is not the case. And when we do that, we go even further into imbalance, okay? That is the first reason that when we start to look into this and we don't have enough information, we go the wrong way and then we get ill, okay? It is wonderful today that Ayurveda has become so popular in the world and in the West. It is super, because it really means that we're starting to look into a different way of living. But like many things, what happens often is that we take a little bit of information from here, a little bit of information from there, and there's a lot of fake news, as they say, online. Okay, so people take the quizzes on what's your dosha and things like that, and then they get misdiagnosed. Okay, and one of the main reasons that we get misdiagnosed is because you have your original constitution. But as soon as you start to move around in life in general, the imbalances starts to happen. So that means that you then have a constitution in your day-to-day that will show signs that are actually different to what your original constitution is. So what this means is that I can have, let's say, a dominance of kapha, but today, due to my lifestyle choices, I might notice that my vata is really out of balance. So when I take one of these quizzes for myself online, I will seem to correspond very much to the vata constitution or dominance. And then I will then be therefore diagnosed with a vata dominance. And then I will try to work in that way, whether it's actually not what my original constitution is. And the reason I'm talking to you about this specifically today is because that was my own issue. I got misdiagnosed, actually not from online, but from another person originally, because of the signs that were being shown. And we thought that it was meant something, and it actually didn't. And so I then later on tried to balance that out by doing the opposite, really the opposite of what I should be doing. And I developed really a strong imbalance and rashes and problems. And it took me many months before I came back into balance again, thanks to going to actually see a really, really good Ayurvedic doctor. And if any of you watching this is situated in Bali, then reach out to me and I will give you their details because they're here. Okay, so it is really essential to start with reading into who you are from the beginning, okay? before you start to play around too much with self-medication, let's say. Okay, so when it comes to the 3 doshas, I'm not going to go too much into detail, because in the online course that I've put together, that is to come out very, very soon, that is actually a big part of the work. So it's not something that you can just like that find out, oh, this is my constitution, okay? But just to give you an idea so that you can start to look into this, we will, for instance, see that people who have a dominance of vata will be people who are in the physical frame quite thin, okay? Vata people who really have a dominance in vata, they never really have a tendency to put on weight, okay? On the contrary, they might have a difficulty to put on weight, okay? And instead, therefore, they will have a tendency maybe to have a difficulty to keep the warmth inside of them. So those are also people who can have a tendency to be cold a lot. Okay, they will, just as one small thing that you will notice often is that they will complain about being dry in the skin. So they usually, especially when we come into interseasonal times, they will have a tendency to need to moisturize a lot in spring and autumn. Okay, when it comes more on the matter of the mind, let's say, for the vata person, it will be someone who is, when they're in balance, very creative. Okay, they're really creative. They can really see things. They can plan it really well. Okay, and they might need to be directed in one way to go, but they can create from there. When they're out of balance, on the contrary, then they can have really difficulties with concentration. A pitta person will, in the physical side, be quite different to the vata, because they will have the fire inside of them that you will notice. You will notice it on how their skin is. You will feel the stickiness as well. So the dryness of the skin that the vata person will have will not really be that present for the pitta person. They will instead have not fully, but they will have a little bit more of a moist skin, and they might even have a little bit of a tone as well, even when they're not in the sun. But they might even go red quite quickly, but they will definitely go brown as well. Okay, on the physical side, we will not have the thin and fragile frame like vata, but instead we will find there a really quite strong frame. Now, pitta, as I mentioned before, is the one in between. So they're kind of like in the middle. So usually they're quite proportional when it comes to limbs as well. The vata person will have, for instance, the piano fingers more easily, whereas the pitta person, who will not have anything very specific when it comes to the hands. They will just look like they're in proportion to the rest of the body. When it comes to the mind of the pitta person, this is where we will definitely see some differences, and you might even recognize yourself, because we have the fire that's very present, which means that when you're in balance as a pitta person, you will be very focused and you will know where you're going. Okay. However, when not in balance, you will easily develop anger and frustration and jealousy and things like this. Okay. Possessiveness can also be a side of that. Easily sweating, even cold sweating. And then the kapha person, now we're at the third one. So this is really the opposite to the vata person. And here on the body frame, we definitely have on a more larger kind of frame, big boned. Not meaning that they're fat in any way or big. There is that tendency, though, so they need to be really careful because it's the accumulation. But when in balance, they have a really perfect body that actually never really gets sick, and so they have really good joints. They become very flexible. They very rarely hurt themselves. Okay, this is really where we will find the moist skin. Okay, so kapha kind of person have basically a tendency to never develop any wrinkles. They have, you can definitely see quite big teeth, for instance. When you look more into detail in the Ayurvedic teachings about this, it's really fascinating on all the different kinds of things that you can read in just by looking at a person or even just feeling their energy. On the mental level, we will find someone who is much calmer, a good listener instead, maybe, and who will be very loyal as well. And unfortunately, though, if we go into the imbalanced state, it also means that these are the people who will not tell, they will go inwards. Okay, so this is where we have those tendencies to develop sadness and depression. Okay, so these are some very small ideas just to give you some pointers today. And I'm going to end this talk very, very soon. I just wanted, because I promised it, of course, in the beginning, that I would give you a few pointers on small things to know how to balance yourself out when you notice that there are small imbalances happening with you. So I'm going to start with the kapha balancing. Kapha, of course, due to its characteristics, is dominant in winter time in most parts of the world. Okay, you have to remember that there's a difference a little bit depending on where you are. And so this means that balancing kapha needs to happen when, for instance, you start to develop a cough and cold, which is very common. But it can also just be in times when you're feeling quite low and unmotivated to get active. And so I'm going to just give you 3 small tips for each and one of you. Okay, so for each and one of you, of each and one of the doshas, of course. So for instance, a really, really good thing to do for kapha balancing is to make a hot drink. Now, ginger is your best friend as a kapha person, okay? So what you want to do is, in kapha times, you want to make like an infusion, like a tea, so water, with fresh ginger, fresh turmeric, and some hot spices like cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, black pepper. Black pepper is also needed to activate the turmeric in it, actually. And you want to make that into a tea that you boil for about 10 minutes or so, and then you can just let that simmer for an hour if you can. And then you want to drink this when it's in a temperature of like 37 Celsius, so it's okay to drink. And when you drink it, you want to maybe add a little bit of lemon and potentially a little bit of honey in this as well. Honey we always add at the end, or even ideally not even adding it, because honey is best when it's raw. So we don't want to put this into the boiling mixture. Okay. A behavior to adopt when you're noticing that your kapha is not really balanced is as simple as chewing some raw ginger before a meal. It will get your digestion going. Okay, and then when it comes to the third one that I wanted to give for kapha, a very simple yogic tool is Bhastrika breathing. And so this is forceful breathing in and out. You might have heard of breath of fire, which is just a forceful out breath. Bhastrika is in breath and out breath, and it's happening through the nose. So basically it means okay, you do 10 rounds and you don't go too fast, and then you take a few normal breaths. You will notice a bit of a lightness in the head. That's fine. It's not dangerous in any way. So you stop it and you calm down, you breathe a little bit, and you might do it another time as well. What it does is that it brings lightness into the kapha dosha. Okay, so that's 3 tips for kapha balancing. Okay, then we come to vata balancing. So vata balancing needs, especially when we're in the interseason time, so spring and autumn, for instance, because it's a lot of changes in the air, but also very much when we are traveling. One very typical sign of being unbalanced in your vata is just that feel of out of whack when you're in lack of a habitual routine, which can be, for instance, due to traveling. And one very typical thing is you can notice it when there's a bit of constipation that happens. A lot of people think maybe that you shouldn't go to the bathroom every day, that once every 2-3 days is normal. It's not. You have to go every day. Okay, bowel movement I'm talking about here, of course. And so when we notice that it means that we've dried up. And so what we want to do is to find something to balance out our vata. Okay, and a way to balance our vata with a drink, like I mentioned already, is to make a chai kind of drink. Okay, so like a chai we want to take a nut milk. Okay, ideally nuts are really good for vata. So almond milk, for instance, soy milk is great as well, or rice milk as well. And then we want to add in some really warming spices like cinnamon, nutmeg, cloves, saffron as well. And we want to add in some sweetener. Okay, sweetener is really good to for vata. Okay, and then we make that into a chai tea, and we drink more. To adopt for vata is to massage yourself with oil. Specifically sesame oil in the autumn and spring. If it's in summer, you might want to use coconut oil instead because it's a little bit more cooling. And one really good way is to actually to massage it into the soles of your feet. Put socks on before sleeping. It's a good way to balance out your vata. And the last part of vata, the simple yogic tool, is called Nadi Shodhana, the very simplest variation, which basically just means that we inhale on one side, and then we exhale on the other. We come back, we inhale, and we exhale. So meaning starting inhaling on the left, exhaling on the right. We do 5 times that, and then we change it. Inhaling on the right, exhaling on the left. Okay, 5 and then 5. It's a really good way to just soothe and calm down your nervous system. Okay, last one, which is pitta balancing. So when we're in summer and being overactive, and we can notice this when we are overly sweating, when we have a heartburn, acid reflux, when we have diarrhea, for instance, that's definitely a pitta imbalance, or when we just notice a lot of anger, when we start to get rashes or acne, also we need to cool down. So a really good way to cool down, okay, is to have mint tea that we add some cardamom in. It's a really good cooling. Now in summer, if we are sweating a lot, we might feel that it's difficult to drink this tea. We can also drink it cold, of course, but one of the things that I love myself is to drink a lot of water, which I can find hard to do because as a pitta person, for instance, me, I will have maybe a tendency to be drawn to drink something that's sweet instead. So by adding 2 very cooling, good for pitta fruits to my water, then it's nicer to drink. And then we would add slices of cucumber and pieces of watermelon. Behavior to adopt is very typically pitta can actually have a tendency of overweight, of overeating due to anger actually, and this fast kind of behavior that a pitta person with this fire would have. And that would be such a simple thing that you take 3 deep breaths before you start any meal, and that you chew so slowly each bite that you try to increase with 5 minutes more than usual every meal. Okay, so you try to look at because obviously as a pitta person, you might have that focus on eating very fast so that you can go on and do other things. Okay. It is also really good because pitta people can have a tendency to feel very hungry if they're out of balance, to drink a large glass of room temperature water about 20 minutes before a meal. Okay, and the last thing there will be then the little yoga tool for a pitta person. So one thing that is very soothing is what they call box breathing. It means that we inhale for 4, we hold for 4, we exhale for 4, and we hold for 4 as well. And then we keep on going, and we do that 4 counts in our head for about 10 rounds. And if we feel comfortable with it, only if we feel comfortable with it, then we might, after 10 rounds, increase till 5 counts instead. All right. So I hope that this was clear for everyone. And as I mentioned when I first started, if you would like to go a little bit more into depth with this, then please stay tuned, because in the next couple of weeks, I will have finalized my self-knowledge project course that was going to run parallel with the self-image course as well. So a similar kind of size of course. And I will launch that in the next few weeks. So in the self-knowledge project, what we will do is that we will go more into depth into understanding the concepts and understanding oneself, and there will be tools to actually self-diagnose, and then more go into depth with what we need to do in order to create the perfect routine to balance ourselves out. You can, of course, always contact me by email at the email address info@yogishah.com for more information on this. I am so happy that there was some of you that stayed, even though there were a little bit of difficulties in the beginning. Thank you so much. And please feel free to post any comments or questions that you have, or even just send them to me directly via email as well. This streaming will be recorded, so I will end the streaming now, and it will then be available, so you will all be able to watch it again if you wish and share it with other people. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful rest of your day. Namaste.